That course that you are in right now, so she was responsible for teaching this course last year, for a few years. Her research work relates with the city, so that's also why she's here, and I think it will be interesting that pay attention of what she explains, but also a lot of images that can be inspiring for your project. Okay? So please welcome Judith De Jong.
So obviously the series is called What is Architecture, and I think you've seen 5 of these so far, right? 3 last fall and 2 this one. Oh, 1 so far this spring. Okay, so you've seen 4, and I'm the 5th. All right, so all those previous ones that you've seen so far, they're all wrong. Don't pay any attention to anything. That's why I'm the last one. Set the record straight. No, obviously I'm just kidding. You've seen presentations from 4 very smart, thoughtful people who are really thinking seriously about architecture. And I think one of the things that's really important about this set of 5 and the kind of different takes that you're hearing is that, as with so many aspects of architecture, there's really no one definitive answer to what is architecture. Although there might be much that is shared, and I think there are some things that we share across the 5 of us. So, the question is, how do I think about architecture? Well, I would say that architecture is an intellectual practice, that it is first and foremost about ideas. So when Bob talks about architecture being about other architecture, or when Sam talks about architecture of information and communication, or when Paul talks about architecture as being funny or humorous, those are intellectual practices about architecture. And when you develop an intellectual practice for architecture, you always also then have an intellectual history. Your architecture has an intellectual history. We're constantly situating our work among the works, the intellectual work of others in architecture. And that actually has kind of 2 aspects. One is who do you align yourself with? Who are the people with whom you agree or whose work you build off of? But it's also actually important to think about with whom you disagree, with whom you misalign, and the debates that you're setting up with that kind of work. So first and foremost, architecture is an intellectual practice. Secondly, it's a cultural practice. We can't help but be informed by the cultures in which we live and breathe. And I would argue that this cultural practice can be so-called high or low, or anywhere in between. Architecture is a formal practice. It's the way we express ideas and culture. We express ideas and culture through architectural form. Now, this one might seem kind of self-evident, but I'm constantly surprised when I'm out in the world at the number of architects who don't seem to be particularly interested in form. And so I feel like it's necessary to say that architecture is a formal practice. And then lastly, for me in particular, I would say that architecture is an urban practice. For me, architecture is fundamentally defined by its relationship to the city. It both shapes and reflects the city and urban life. And conversely, I understand urbanism as a primarily but not exclusively architectural practice. And so I'm particularly interested in these reciprocating relationships between architecture and urbanism, because they quite literally form every metropolis, from historic to contemporary. These relationships also occur at a range of scales. One of those is the large urban plan. Those of you in first year are working obviously at that scale. But those relationships can also occur at the scale of the individual building or project. And that individual building or project can, but often doesn't, operate as an effective agent of urban design. So what does that mean? How can a building, just a single building, operate as urban design? Well, I have up here a picture of a kind of normative parking garage in downtown Chicago. It's not interested in architecture. It's certainly not interested in the city. What this parking garage is interested in doing is storing as many cars as possible and generating as much revenue as possible. So it's a strictly utilitarian structure. and really no interest in architecture or urbanism. In contrast, this is 1111 Lincoln Road in Miami by Herzog and Demeron. It is also a parking garage. And I chose the parking garage because I think in some respects it's one of the most banal structures we see in the city. So this is also a parking garage. It's for 300 cars. It's specifically built for the office building that you see kind of peeking out behind it. But it's also meant as public parking for the public promenade, which is on the street. It's blocked off here. You can't see it through the construction fences, but that is a pedestrian street in Miami. And it's meant as public parking for that street. Now, the architects conceived of this garage as, quote, all muscle without cloth. So they stripped the cast-in-place concrete garage to its bones. They eliminated exterior walls, expressed the slabs, ramps, and columns of the 6 parking levels, provided open stairs and frameless elevators, limited visible pipes, and used a grade of concrete that shows its imperfections. And so from the standpoint of its architecture, it's actually referencing a series of one in particular early modernist parking garage that was done in Miami by an architect named Robert Law Weed in 1948. It was the first open-air concrete garage and was one of the first to show that architecture could really be about, that concrete structures could really be about lightness. And so they're referencing this history of architecture in Miami. But it's really the attitude of the garage towards the city that elevates this into architecture. Their idea here is to extend the street into the sky. If we think of the street as one of the primary spaces of urban life, they're pulling it up and into the sky, organizing space and collective life along the way. And this notion of the street and sky is a recurring speculative urban idea that actually plays out in some Asian cities, as you guys know. So they're taking that recurring idea and saying, we can develop this from the standpoint of the automobile. If we use that notion of the automobile street and pull it up into the sky, how does that organize life above the ground? They, obviously this is under construction, so it doesn't fully show, but they infilled the ground floor with retail and restaurants that opens up to the public promenade. They raised the height of the 5th level so that they can introduce a store, so that retail activity actually gets pulled up and into the sky on the 5th floor. You can park right next to the store, very convenient. And then again on the 7th level, they raised it to 34 feet, which is enormous for a parking garage. But the idea here was that it would actually become an event space. This is actually one of the most spectacular spaces in the city with one of the most spectacular views. And as a result, this has become one of the most popular places to have public events in the city, or private events for that matter. And so this idea of bringing collective life up off the street and into the sky has contributed in part to the resurgence of this particular area of the city. And so what we see here is a dynamic merger of the architecture of the automobile with an urbanism of density and collective life, and an example of how the individual project can operate as an agent of urban design. Now, despite recent claims to the contrary, contemporary urbanism remains fundamentally shaped by architecture. And architecture's historical role as a primary means of materializing ideas about the city and urban life remain critical as the world becomes increasingly and dominantly urban. This is true even, and particularly, maybe even especially, as what constitutes the forms, spaces, and ways of life of the urban is really changing dramatically. So for me, the urban is no longer defined solely by the forms of the traditional city, exemplified by historic Paris or Boston, or even a place like downtown Chicago, which is of course much newer. Rather, the urban condition is really broader, it's looser, it's messier, it's much more in between, and we see this most vividly in newer American cities like Atlanta, which you're looking at, or Houston, or the subject of my current fourth-year option studio, Tyson's Corner, Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C. And so while the urban in these places, and I use urban here very broadly, remains a shaper of both individual and collective life, the forms and spaces in which that have happened have also significantly changed, and are now just as likely to be the spaces of mass culture, such as the shopping mall, the parking lot, or similar. I love this image. This is Southdale Mall in Edina, Minnesota, which is outside of Minneapolis. This was the first enclosed shopping mall. It's designed by Victor Gruen. And Gruen believed that the shopping mall could be what he called a crystallization point, a centering of new post-war American residential suburbs. And so he designed part of the impetus for the interiorization of this space was the idea that these could be collective spaces for new suburban life. And I love this because the idea that there would be a formal dance in the mall in the 60s, like we think of that maybe as a little bit quaint right now, but it really showed the power of this particular location of the mall as an opportunity for collective life. This is still true. This is the gallery in Houston, anchored by a ice rink that is tremendously popular. And we also see it in places like parking lots. This is the parking lot of a grocery store in Anaheim, California, that hosts traveling carnivals and generates a kind of public life out of that. Now, because these more open, formal, and spatial patterns often have little obvious order, and because the buildings are usually quite banal, these conditions are often easily dismissed. But I would argue there's significant value in understanding them, however, because they're not only the largest and fastest growing parts of the metropolis, but they're also evolving extremely quickly. And thus, they're the primary locales of potentially innovative new architectures, new urbanisms, new audiences, and new ways of life. And these are the locales, basically, conditions I would consider very hybrid, in which I'm most interested right now. So places like Atlanta. So back to that comment about intellectual histories. So influences often change over time. And as I said, it's often important not only to articulate with whom you align, but also with whom you misalign. So here are some sources with whom I misalign. In fact, sources with whom I have come to disagree quite significantly. The Machine in the Garden is a seminal book by the cultural historian Leo Marx, which basically argues that early America was a pastoral landscape that was a mediating, basically a cultivated garden that mediated between civilization as understood by, as represented by the city, and wilderness. And this argument about the pastoral has become the dominant narrative for most histories of contemporary, and by that I mean post-20th century and particularly post-war, World War II American suburbia, such as Crabgrass Frontier. This is the absolute dominant narrative of suburbia, and it's very residentially focused. But it's actually extremely narrow and ignores a whole other range of suburbias. And so I've come to find that while these are valuable, that they are too limiting and actually counterproductive for many kinds of ways of thinking about suburbia and suburbanized metropolis. So two books that have been much more recently influential to me are Rainer Banham's Los Angeles, The Architecture for Ecologies, which was published in 1971. The importance of this book is that he was the first to radically reconceptualize the way we read Los Angeles and introduce a new way of thinking about that kind of city. Learning from Las Vegas, from Robert Venturi to D. Scott Brown and Stephen Eisenhower from 1972, so roughly at the same time, which was an argument for a new vision of the communicative capacity of the commercial strip. So these have been two, I think, very important books for me, ideas for me. I'm also influenced quite a bit by American movies and television. This is a set of movies from the last 35 years that has been cited at the American Shopping Mall and kind of reinforced course, the importance of that kind of new post-war space as important as a collective center. I don't know, how many of you have seen the original Dawn of the Dead, 1978? Okay, so there are clips on YouTube. It's really fantastic. It's when zombies were still slow and stupid, as opposed to now when they're like fast and really scary. I don't like current zombies, but the old ones are pretty fun. And there's this great clip from Dawn of the Dead where there are two people in a helicopter and they're on the roof. They're trying to find a safe place to land, and they've landed on the roof of the Monroeville Mall outside of Pittsburgh. And they look around, there are all these zombies walking really slowly, because again, they're very slow at this point, towards the mall. And the lady says, "Why are they coming here?" And the guy answers, "Well, this was important in their lives. This place was important in their lives, and so they feel compelled to come here." And we see that played out time and again in stories about American life. Fast Times at Ridgemont High, I realize all these were like out before you were born, but they're classics. Seriously, trust me. David Byrne from the Talking Heads in True Stories, and one you might have seen from Mallrats. They're not there to shop, they're not there to work, they're just there. Okay, how does all of this come together in some of the work that I've been doing? Well, I'm particularly interested in the way that these kinds of traditional post-war suburbias are changing. Many of them are urbanizing. So one project I did a couple years ago was in response to a competition called Build a Better Burb that was held in 2010. And it was specifically looking at how the suburbs of Long Island, outside of New York City, are changing. And in particular, how many of them are urbanizing. And so this was a speculative design project. And I'm particularly interested in, rather than importing new urban forms into suburbs, can suburbs urbanize from their own forms? Can we use the existing forms of suburbia to develop new forms of high-density suburbanisms, basically? And so this particular project argued that the often vilified standard forms and conditions of suburbia, in this case the strip mall and the superblock, could in fact be the generative agents of suburbia's reformation and urbanization. And so what I did was propose a new opportunistic and adaptable strip mall typology that not only accommodated new audiences such as young adults and seniors, but also staged new opportunities for collective life. And so basically I took the iconic shape of the L shape of the strip mall, flipped the parking behind, programmed that space on the street, stacked new forms of housing on top, and allowed that reveal in between to become residential parking. Because, you know, one school of thought on urbanizing suburbs is that we should go car-free. But really, many American suburbs are really defined by automotive culture, and I would argue that while there should be more options for mobility in places like this, that just totally eliminating the car is actually eliminating an important cultural aspect of many suburbs. But we have to do parking in much smarter ways. So that in this case, parking is lifted and handled in a different way. And as you can see, then it starts to aggregate. We can choose our own sites. I found a site in Hicksville. This is the Long Island Railroad with an express train to Manhattan. It takes about half an hour or 40 minutes. But what was important to me here was that is the Broadway Mall. The Broadway Mall is a really interesting mall, as it has struggled to remain competitive. Its anchor stores, which were typically department stores, have mostly gone out of business. And so it has replaced its anchor stores with an IKEA and a Target. And so this is now the only IKEA on Long Island, and that has in fact rejuvenated the mall. So I was interested in how we might start to locate higher density suburban housing in between the train station and the mall. And you can see how this aggregated strip gets deployed. And then how those courts can be, those new public courts can be programmed with public events here at the train station. Here, this actually abuts a typical residential suburban neighborhood, so more domestically programmed events. Or across from the Target, this particular Target has groceries but no produce, so the idea would be that that court could be programmed with the farmer's market to complement the grocery shopping that happens in Target. So, as with so many things in architecture, architecture. I did this in 2 weeks because the timing was really bad, and that's just how those things go. So while I was happy, I was a finalist in this competition. I was really happy about that. I think the ideas were strong and came across well, but I wasn't really happy with the form, actually. So I continued to work on it. Instead of using the L strictly in plan, I started to look at how it might aggregate more three-dimensionally, and so I've continued to develop it in a way that provides, I would say, more of a visual marker from afar on the train or the highway. So these are the same views, but with this kind of next round of work. And so this design project aligns with my most recent project, which is a book that came out last fall called New Suburbanisms, that explores what I would say is the hybridization of the American metropolis. And in it, I basically argue that many suburbs are becoming more similar to their central cities, and that at the same time, cities are becoming more similar to their suburbs. This is a process I characterize as a conceptual flattening, and this process is both effect and cause. It's driven by substantial demographic and cultural change, and it's evidenced by new spatial and formal practices. And as a result, flattening makes architectural and urban innovation possible. These novel practices are exemplified in the emergence of hybrid suburban-urban, thus this suburban, for short, conditions such as interstitial parking, the residential densification of suburbia, which was what that competition was about, inner-city big box retail, among others. I would say each of these new suburbanisms reflects to varying degrees the reciprocating influences of the urban and the suburban. And at the same time, these hybrid practices reconfigure conventional understandings of these familiar terms, thereby offering opportunities for design innovation and development of new ways of forming the evolving American metropolis. So I'm just going to show you some spreads from the book, some of the diagrams. Looking at, for example, the way work has that the ways that employment or work have reorganized American cities into much more polynuclear conditions. Focus on different kinds of hybridization, in this case car space, then later domestic space, public space, retail space, and then so those are looking at individual buildings or projects, and then there's a chapter called Mix and Match, which looks at how these aggregate into larger environments. Some of the projects that are included, this was an early project by Victor Gruen, the Milron's department store. One of my favorite projects ever, the best parking lot showroom by site, which looked at rethinking the suburban big box, in this case by pulling the parking lot up and over the store. This is heavily influenced by Venturi and Scott Brown's ideas about the commercial strip. Here's that great parking garage by Kurtzheim and Nimron, looking at public space, the kind of hyper-programming of public space, and how I would argue that's influenced by the way we now engage in shopping malls. And then finally, I've just started a design project. We're only just now getting into it. This is the new museum in New York by Sana. I really like Sana's work. And I visited it for the first time a few years ago, and I was sitting inside on the ground floor having a cup of coffee, looking around and realizing, oh my God, this is a big box. I mean, it really is. The interiors are really very much like big boxes. And I went outside and I saw that Hell Yeah project there, and I thought, God, that looks like a Toys R Us logo. And I thought, what if this was a new model for thinking about the way the big box would enter the city in ways that are much more sophisticated than, say, some of the Target versions we've seen in Chicago, like over on Roosevelt Road. And so, obviously, this is conceptually just an idea, but been working with my research assistant, Stuart, on how that would in fact translate. So this is very, very early. This is one of the very first drawings we've done. It's not very far along, but an example of the other kinds of projects. This is also, any of you know the movie Repo Man? No. So one of the recurring jokes in Repo Man is generic like food. So the idea here is that instead of using actual logos, that we would just use the name like parking or cafe, and that would start to create the kind of logo would be much more generic, and so stores could start to come in and out as they change, because as we know, big boxes are becoming an endangered species, and certain ones are thriving and certain ones are failing. So the ability to kind of shift in and out as that suburban typology comes into the city and urbanizes is actually a really important idea. So that's what that is. Okay. I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Why can I get that book?
Well, it's on Amazon, so anyone who's interested can find it on Amazon. And actually, if you go to Amazon, there are always, of course, cheaper versions, other booksellers that you can access through Amazon that sell it a little bit cheaper.
What's the name?
It's called New Suburbanisms. I can do that because I'm not your teacher.
You just said a little more.
Usually in the teaching class, you like,
No. Yeah, right. We're not like the math teacher who writes the textbook and then requires it of everyone. I'm going to get rich. I think I make like 2 cents a copy, so no one's getting rich off of it. Yeah, fine.
Suburban malls, I think over time became sort of cultural centers of necessity. Do you think this sort of new typology, this new urban typology can have the same effect?
So, I'm sorry, the suburban
Sorry,
mall.
suburban malls became sort of cultural centers out of necessity, I think, because of proximity. There's, that's the one point of conglomeration that you can go to. Do you think this new urban typology can have the same effect?
Probably not to the extent that a suburban mall would. I think that's a great question. It's true that one of the reasons that malls became a kind of de facto collective center in post-war suburbs was because there really often weren't a lot of other options. I'm just thinking about whenever I ask, how many of you hung out at the mall growing up? Okay. How many of you hung out at like a park? Okay. So the thing is, a lot of you are from the city, and so you had a lot more options, right? But for those of you in a kind of more typical post-war suburb, the mall was often the primary option. So I would say this probably wouldn't have the same level of draw. But one of the things we're thinking about here, and again, it's really early, is how like more public facilities would be located in here to pull people in that weren't necessarily shopping. So, for example, that gym is actually thought of as more of a YMCA or kind of public field house.
Now, do you think this vertical type might actually work well in the suburbs instead of in the city?
Sure, actually I do, because I think that's a great question. I mean, the point here is this kind of hybridization, and so this would be testing one limit, like how tall could it get, what could it be, but we're actually seeing the kinds like, so for example, Chicago, we see a lot of versions of the kind of hybridizing big box. One such example, most of you have probably been over here to this Target here in the West Loop, right? So they basically took the typical suburban condition of Target and parking lot, and they did this, right? There's probably just as much parking there as there would be at a typical Target, but they handle it a little bit differently. They pulled the big box to the street, thought about how you would move up and down. So there are different versions here, but I think that what we're seeing though is those kinds of versions are actually then so if the big box is migrating into the city and adapting, it's also then migrating back out into urbanizing suburbs. And so we're seeing versions of that in places like Tyson's Corner, Virginia, or places like West Hollywood, California, or more kind of hybrid conditions on the periphery of major cities like Seattle. So absolutely, I think a version of this, probably a shorter version initially, could migrate back out.
I have a question about, I guess I could relate to the big box. And I don't know, personally, I feel like it's like really driven by like, I guess like economical thinking about it. Like it's bare bones, and in certain ways, like I guess like it's the modern day department store, where I guess like it's the primary type. So I guess like my question is like, how do you think like an architect can, I guess, be the bigger person instead of the economist, where like they're the ones generating the ideas versus, you know, like, well, I don't know, is it making this money? Kind of like when you talk about the parking garage and like, I don't know. How do you get your point across, I guess?
Well, I think there's no question that like the typical big box, I mean, those aren't architecture. They're just buildings built for efficiency and economics. But what we're finding is that the economics of the big box are really super competitive. Of retail in general right now is really super competitive. And so those that wish to remain intact and alive and continue to exist are having to adapt. And for the big box, one of the untapped markets was in fact inner cities. And so what you find with Target is that the reason you see a lot of Targets in Chicago or other major cities is that Target has been willing to change its format. And in its willingness to change its format, it has hired architects. So for example, it hired architects when it went into Carson Perry Scott. It also has an in-house design team. Walmart, on the other hand, has been completely unwilling to change its format until very, very recently. And as a result, it has been shut out of urban markets. And so the irony is that in the thinking that design was not a necessity, they actually shut themselves out of certain markets. And Home Depot has, in fact, been willing to go into cities and change their format and hire architects. And so what we're finding is that architecture actually has improved their bottom line.
So you mentioned the flattening of suburban versus urban and how one is becoming more like the other and vice versa. So do you predict that, like how blurred do you see that boundary becoming between the two? Like will they become one? Getting at something like you think?
That is a great question. Did everyone hear it? So I would say that I don't think that it means that everything all becomes the same. I think there will still probably always be those kind of polar opposites of that kind of traditional residential suburb single-family house on the individual lot at the periphery of the city. There will probably always be some version of that to some extent, and then we'll still see inner city Boston and New York and Chicago. But I think that what we find in between is a whole kind of gradation that will sometimes get denser, sometimes get less dense, sometimes get taller, sometimes get shorter. That it's that whole area in between that's going to provide, actually, I think, quite a lot of difference, while also still being hybridized. Does that make sense?
So I have another one. So like, who would you consider to be like incubators of all this? I guess of this flattening. Do you think it just what do you think is like the incubators of it?
Who's the what of it?
Like the incubators, like the people like facilitating or the forces that facilitating like the flattening of the landscape.
Well, I would say that that's actually a pretty complicated answer. The answer to that's pretty complicated. First of all, I would say that so one of the arguments in the book is that there's actually a parallel trajectory of suburbia, which is a suburbanization of work. And whereas people like Kenneth Jackson have really focused attention on residential suburbia and have, I would say wrongly, helped narrow the discourse to that from the beginning of cities even, we've seen commercial suburbs. This diagram is from J.M. Wagstaff. This is the typical Mesopotamian city in 3,000 years before Christ. So 5,000 years ago, the typical Mesopotamian city had a commercial suburb. So yeah, people lived here, but people also worked here. And what we know, if we look at that alternative trajectory, we find that there are actually this whole range of already hybridized environments that you find throughout metropolitan areas. And those are one of the primary locales of these kinds of interesting changing in between conditions. And I would say that the other thing is that we're seeing some massive demographic and cultural change in American suburbs. The assumptions about who lives there and why are actually, many of those assumptions are wrong. And many of even the ones that were more true are changing substantially. So there are actually a lot of forces at work that are generating, some very historical and some much more contemporary.
How do you envision, we've been looking at like America specifically, but how do you envision for maybe some of the very overpopulated, like Latin America, Asia, how do you envision this big box kind of typology? Have you thought about in other places besides the U.S.?
So I purposely narrowed the argument to American suburbia because it was such a big topic that I was getting off track. Like it was hard to kind of make sense of an international condition. So one of the things I say in the preface is that I hope that by helping people rethink the American city, that it might also generate some parallel rethinking of international cities. I don't know enough about some of those other cities, peripheries versus the interior, to kind of really answer that. But I'm hoping that this might generate some other study by others that can talk to that. It's a great question. Yeah.
So my question about more European older cities. How do you think that the big box would be incorporated into them into their suburbs and stuff like that?
Yeah, so again, I really haven't studied this in any detail for international cities. And certainly we have other people who could speak to that. Some of your professors could speak to that more fully, but I would say, just based on the European cities that I know, first of all, the big box is not a strictly American phenomenon. We see it in Europe. I can't pronounce it. Yeah. I can't say that. So,
Which means crossroad.
but what's interesting is one of the things that has helped the big box as it has entered the more traditionally dense American city is that there are actual big sites and big floor plates that have been repurposed. So for example, if you're downtown and you're going to Target, that was a department store that failed, right? That was Carson Pirie Scott. And we see the same thing in New York in an area called the Ladies Mile, which is at the beginning of the last century, the center of department stores in New York, and many of those department stores have failed over time. And for a long time, no one knew what to do with those floor plates because they were so big. And so, in a way, the U.S. city can accommodate that better because there are these spaces that actually work pretty well for a big box. Very few of the European cities that I've ever visited have those kinds of big, empty spaces, in my experience, which is pretty limited. So I think it would probably be harder, depending on the age of the city, which is not to say it couldn't happen.
What initially piqued your interest in hybridization? Like, did you notice like one day that like in terms of like location or convenience or like commute to work, like what was the biggest factor?
Yeah, so I actually used to live in Houston, and Houston was shocking and surprisingly livable, actually. I was really surprised at how livable it was, even though there were, in many ways, lots of problems. And so I was trying to understand Houston. because it was not like the cities I understood growing up, which were primarily East Coast cities like New York and Philly and Boston. And so I started reading. And the literature at the time, which this would have been the 1990s, was very much along the lines of that pastoral argument from Marx and the kind of crabgrass frontier idea. And yet as I looked around, I thought, well, that doesn't really match. Like, why are people talking about it this way when I just looked around and that's not really happening? So when I left Houston and had a little critical distance and started going back and visiting, I realized that, in fact, it was changing, that my hunch that it was changing was actually true, that it was changing really substantially. And then I realized from living in Chicago that some similar things were happening here. And on first glance, Houston and Chicago are totally different cities. And yet they had some similar things at work. And so that's actually what generated this kind of interest. Yeah?
Are these investigations something that you do on your own time, on the side, or is it something that your department can do, or how does that work?
So, as a full-time faculty member, the great thing is that I get paid to do this kind of thing. Which is pretty great, I have to say. I don't get paid very much, but I get paid to do. There are lots of people who work full-time in firms or for other people in firms and are able to do these things on their own time, and I'm incredibly impressed with people who can do that. But I've largely worked on it here. I've applied for grants with various outside agencies like the Grant Foundation to be able to hire people to work with me. I've hired a lot of students actually over the last 5 years to work with me. I've also used the Chancellor's Undergraduate Research Award, which all of you are eligible for actually, to again work with, have student help, all of whom are credited. Actually, I acknowledge first of all, you get paid, and secondly, you get credit because there's a lot of intelligence that's been contributed to this by other people. And so those are some of the ways that I have been able to work this through. Yeah. Okay, I think maybe one last question. One last question? Can I take it from someone who hasn't asked a question? Is that okay? Yeah.
Do you think the malls can be reintroduced back, particularly to the city of Chicago? Because I remember that probably 10, 20 years ago, malls were like strong hubs in the city. And some malls that I think of are like Ford City or the Brickyard Mall or Harlem Urban Plaza. But as time goes on, it just seems like those become less and less important. And so I thought initially maybe it has to do something with the location because they're so far out to the west side of Chicago. But then when you look at also the new mall that was introduced on State Street and Randolph, Block 37, it just seems like that one's also still struggling for some reason. So I'm wondering maybe if malls just don't work anymore in the city, or maybe it just has to be introduced in some sort of new way.
So one of the things that we've seen in the last 20 to 30 years in American metropolises is that they're what's called over-retailed. That retailers build too much stuff. And so the impact of over-retailing has been the closing of underperforming malls, underperforming stores. This has been happening for years, actually, but was amplified by the credit crisis of 2008. Okay, so at the same time, what we've been seeing is that most of the malls, for example, that failed were malls that were focused almost exclusively on retail. And one of the things that we've seen is that malls that have remained competitive are in fact, whether they know it or not, returning to Victor Bruin's original principles of mall as a de facto collective center. And so you're starting to see, and actually not just starting, you see a lot more integration of other kinds of activities and uses and a kind of conscious integration of those things as a way to maintain their audiences. Now, the problem with all of this is that, again, they're usually driven by economics, and architects haven't really grabbed onto this as an opportunity to design, to really get involved in designing these new ways of suburban life. And I would argue that that's an opportunity. That if architects were more involved in thinking about this more as an intellectual project, that we would actually see much better architecture and much more innovative forms of collective space around malls that are, in fact, vibrant and thriving. Okay, thank you very much. Have fun.